Okay, let me just share my screen then. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for today. I'll give a quick introduction to CDP, which used to be called Carbon Disclosure Project. And after that, also talk a bit about how data is being used for ESG investing, particularly our data, the CDP data for that. So with that, well, let me do a quick introduction to CDP. We are basically the global corporate environmental disclosure system. We've been operating for over 20 years. Our goal actually is to make the planet a balance between economic growth with environmental impact. And we run a global disclosure system for cities, companies, as well as states to report. This is a voluntary reporting system, but it's very much the gold standard, including companies like Tesla, who actually report to us via the system. And we provide the data that we collect from them to government, policymakers around the world, as well as to investors and different customers. So firstly, how we work, we have the questionnaire that we have developed based on inputs from government, from companies, as well as investors. We run the cycle starting from April to August, where companies, cities, suppliers fill in the questionnaire. They return the data to us. We collect the data, and then we provide the data back to our authorities, which are investors, companies, and government. This data consists of three main areas. The first being carbon emission, the second being water usage, and the third being biodiversity. In terms of who is part of our stakeholders within CDP, in terms of our investors, about 600 investors, which over $110 trillion of assets. We also have customers who request their suppliers. So these include 200 plus what we call supply chain members, representing over $5.5 trillion in purchasing power. And they request their suppliers to disclose via CDP. We also have 13,000 companies that respond to our questionnaire in 2021. This represents about 64% of global market capitalization. So pretty much every major company reports to us, including 80% of S&P 500, including Tesla, who also reports to us as well. In addition to that, there's also 1,100 cities that report to us via our cities questionnaire. In terms of who uses the CDP data, the policy community, so governments, for example, use our data that we collect so that they can then analyze the data and decide what regulation they want to introduce in their local market. We also provide government benchmarks of what happens globally, so they also can decide what they want to implement in the local environment. We also provide the data to the business community, to the finance community, so they can analyze ESG trends and decide, for example, which suppliers do they want to use based on the different ESG standards or ESG thresholds that they want to implement. We also provide the data to other NGOs, to media, to academic institutions, so they can write research and insights into the data. So that's who we are. As mentioned, we've been operating over 20 years. I'm responsible for the Asia Pacific region. Within this region itself, we have offices in Delhi, Beijing, Tokyo, as well as Hong Kong. And I'm based in Singapore, and we're in the process of setting up an office here in Singapore. Within the Asia region, we have about 80 people. Globally, we have around 500 people in CDP. So next few slides, I'll talk a bit more about investment and how data, CDP data, is being used in different investment products. So the first use case I'll touch on is sustainability-linked loans. So these are basically loans provided to institutions, companies, based on different ESG measurements, for example. So I have two cases over here, one from the CIMB, provided to Malaran, which is a subsidiary of StarHub. it is tied to the performance of the parent company, in this case StarHub, on the annual CDP disclosure. So we score the different companies that disclose to us, and if the score is above a certain grade, this loan actually gets a rebate based on the score. So in this case, StarHub was an A-, so they received the rebate in 2020 for the loan. For this. Another one we have is an engineering contractor in Taiwan, where again is linked to the sustainability loan, and it's again tied to the targets as part of the loan criteria in there. So this is one way in which you will see more sustainability measures being incorporated into the loans which the different financial institutions across the region will provide moving forward. And this is partly because the growing number of financial institutions have ESG requirements, and hence also they are gradually incorporating different loan standards, loan criteria into their lending. So these are just two examples. Derivatives. So it's interesting also that we are starting to see the use of CDP data in derivative instruments. In this case, a sustainability-linked derivative. So instead of going through the actual details of that, this particular derivative is a forward contract. It is tied to specific standards within the CDP criteria. And if they hit those standards, then they were able to receive a rebate on those derivatives. So now here's a slightly different case as well. In this case, it's actually an index. An index has been developed by a policy body, this one based in China, whereby it is a brand index of the different brands within that. So as you know, most companies value their brand. It's often their biggest investment that most companies make is actually into their brands as well. So in this case, there was a brand that was developed based on different criteria of governance, measurement, targets, and climate. And the CDP score is one reference that is being used into this index. And this index then will be used by customers as well as by suppliers to evaluate, in fact, a brand's climate transparency. And this particular index was launched in China this year. Now, the other element also where we see ESG data being used is in equity indices. So this is more common in Europe and in the US, where a number of indexes incorporate ESG criteria. And then as a result of that, the environmental score is measured and then puts it as a criteria for inclusion into that index. So the CDP data itself is being used in two indices in this case, one a Euronext index and one the stocks index. In both cases, where the CDP disclosure is an input into those scores and into those indices. Now, the last one that I'll touch on is on equity funds. As you know, a number of indices, particularly ESG type indices, have exchange-traded funds developed from that. So these funds track the performance of the index. So in the case of this fund, for example, the CPR investment fund, it is tied to the CDP score. It's been operating, in fact, since 2018, has been very successful, in fact, at generating interest and also raising funds for that. And the CDP data is used actually as a scoring mechanism criteria for that fund to be included into that fund as an investment. And then within that investment pool, the investment manager then will decide where to invest within that. So this is just some case studies of how data is being used for ESG products. Because I thought I'll instead of just focusing on ESG as an investment, I'll focus more on specific case studies so that the audience can be familiar on how products are structured and potentially how ESG data is being used and being included into these products so that they become, investors can better assess the ESG criteria within that. So with that, that ends my presentation. Let me stop sharing my screen now. So.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chan, for very insightful presentations.